I think his next term, if you want to talk just inside Bernie, I think we've already seen that, the letter he fired off after the election was a different Bernie. It was back to this party has abandoned the working class. So I do think there's a chance that, we'll see more independence. I don't think he's going to sort of do a dirty break because I don't think there's any. I don't think, I mean, this is maybe we come back to the 1850s now and talk about this, about
Please.
where and when and how, because the Republican Party was a third party. But I think, and I actually think there's a lot of lessons in this moment for the left today, for like on the electoral front, on the sort of political front, on this question of like building a mass politics to challenge really entrenched institutions that have bipartisan support, whether it's the healthcare industry or slavery, or the sort of U.S. foreign policy consensus or whatever it may be. And this is why, I've been writing a book about this for almost, 8 years now. And I think, but I do think that there also, I would say at the outset, some obvious like structural differences. There was political parties had far less control over ballot lines in the 19th century than they do now. And the best piece on this, as far as I know, is still Seth Ackerman's kind of classic article in Jacobin. You may remember it, Brie, I don't know, but he wrote a piece about, about the United States as we talk about Soviet Russia as a one-party state, that we live in a two-party state. And like, that isn't an accident. But it's like, you can recount that cut and dried history about political party control over ballots as sort of an example, as an argument. I think it can be two things at once. It's one, an argument about the power of this ogiopoly, I don't know how to say it, oligopoly, whatever it is, duopoly. And you can say in cold, hard ink that here it is. And you can also say, yeah, but you have to take that reality seriously as a strategic actor in that world. You can't wish your way into another world by just saying, oh, this is so morally outrageous. We need to sort of think our way through it. We need to sort of campaign on that terrain that has been established. And it is a sort of a different terrain just from my perspective. And I'm not an expert on the ballot stuff, but from what I've read, it's a very different terrain than the more fluid moment in the 19th century, when you had all sorts of third parties. You had anti-Masonic parties that surged into power, and in the 1820s, you had temperance movements, although they never really had a big national party. You had nativist Know Nothing party that had a huge wave in the 1850s that was actually in contention with the anti-slavery forces for a long time. I'm, written a bunch of chapters about that. And then above all, you had abolitionist third parties. You had the Liberty Party, you had the Free Soil Party, and then you had the Republicans. And all of these parties at the state level, at the national level, at the congressional, local level, they were able to sort of go from zero to relevance pretty quickly, pretty easily, because as powerful as the sort of the Whigs and Democrats, the two-party system of that era was, it had nothing like the reach and the sort of entrenchment as the current system is sort of what I fear.
So let's putting the ballot ballot line control issues to the side, since neither of us here are admittedly experts about it.
Totally.
Just lay out for us what happened as complete know-nothings, as naives who are coming to this issue area really fresh. And some listeners who might not have even realized that it wasn't always, since time immemorial, a Democratic Party and a Republican Party. Set up for us what was going on in the mid-19th century and how we got to the emergence of this third party as one of our two major parties because of the issue of abolition.
Yeah. So essentially, I invoke some of the differences, but look, in a broad sense, there are a lot of parallels, in the sense that my view and this is contentious, historians will argue about this, but I'm just going to give you the Matt Karp version. I'm not going to pretend that this is like a universal historical consensus, although some things that I say, I think are, broadly the profession would agree. But in my view, it's clear that by the mid-19th century, a majority of voting white citizens, that is adult men, and with a handful of African-American men in the North, strongly opposed slavery. That was on a moral level, on a political level, would have agreed if there had been opinion polling in 1840. It's obvious to me that based on the results of, say, elections where they were going to potentially, bring slavery into Illinois or Indiana or some of these states that were actually really conservative then, that were swing states, that were pro-Southern, that were Democratic pro-Southern states, the idea of actually having slavery in Illinois was, by the 1840s, hugely unpopular. And you read even in the pro-slavery Democratic Party never campaigned on slavery in Illinois. It always dodged the issue and tried to talk about race or tried to talk about something else where they thought they had the winds at their back. So it's clear that the institution of slavery and the sort of U.S. government support for slavery, which it offered a great deal of in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, that I wrote my first book about this, as a sort of essentially a pro-slavery government, did not rest on popular consent. It did not rest on all the American people were just so racist and so hateful that they demanded to keep African Americans enslaved in the South. There were a minority that felt that way in the North, but I think a definitely distinct minority. The power of slavery rested first on the power of masters in the South and the way that they used that power to sort of dominate state governments. And, Alabama was only something like 30% of Alabama were slaveholders, but the state legislature was like 85% slaveholder. So the power of slavery rested on first Southern political power in the South, and then Southern political power in the federal government, because national parties had to win Southern states to get elected. And then national institutions, the national market, merchants and capitalists in Wall Street who did a lot of trade with the South, they weren't dependent on slavery. I don't go with that version of the argument, but they were interpenetrated with slavery, and they saw no profit in emancipation, and they didn't want to rock the boat. Broadly, the sort of financial class. So you had popular opposition to slavery mixed with strong institutional support for it. And to me, this is like a classic dilemma of the left. It's not a class political situation, but, again, I think today we have a broad popular hostility and opposition to sort of, status quo institutions in this country along the lines of wealth, jobs, distribution of opportunities, and economic security, essentially, whether they be the sort of the basic welfare state goods like health, housing, childcare, whether they be about sort of the ability to sort of reliably pay to support one's family, with reliable, good paid work, meaning in life, requires this economic foundation. And we have a huge, I think, supermajority coalition in support of that, but various institutional actors, principally the political parties, that are not interested in offering that kind of politics. And that's how it was in the 1840s and 50s. You had the two parties were the strongest arms of that. They were the place where all those institutions, economic, local, political, where they sort of took shape. And so you had the Democrats, which were probably the more pro-slavery party, and then you had the Whigs, which was the party of the sort of northern business classes, and to some extent also progressive reformers were lumped in together. Again, sounds familiar probably to some extent, where you had the sort of the more dynamic economic elements of the society, like today you would say Silicon Valley, venture capitalists and hedge funds. For all of this talk about Musk, they still donate overwhelmingly to Democrats. The Democrats are still the party of, all these things happen in blue states, Elon Musk moved to Texas, but Austin is blue, it's blue cities, it's mostly blue states, it's blue donors from the middle up in all of these kind of, dynamic kind of 21st century capitalist foundations. That's another kind of parallel to the Whig Party, which was the sort of more industrial, more mercantile, more not necessarily more mercantile, but more they were the party of sort of incipient American industrialization in the North. Anyway, and the Whig Party had an anti-slavery wing. There were anti-slavery Whigs, but every time when the rubber hit the road, they knuckled under to the National Party, to the pro-Southern Party, to the sort of more conservative powers that be within the Whig Party. And you saw this most vividly in 1850 when a Whig president, Millard Fillmore from New York, who had an anti-slavery record, signed the Fugitive Slave Act as part of the 1850 compromise package. And so essentially in response to that, anti-slavery activists for over a generation had sort of sought to build a kind of an opposition to this. And, some abolitionism was anti-electoral. Obviously Garrison famously burned the Constitution and abjured electoral politics. Frederick Douglass initially was the same. There were all sorts of other radical abolitionists who said, actually, and then this is what Douglass then transitioned to becoming, that, and Garrett Smith and others who said actually the Constitution is inherently anti-slavery because, it's based on the Declaration, which says that all men are created equal. So slavery is illegal ipso facto, and the government should emancipate the slaves like tomorrow, just to follow the law of the Constitution. This was also a pretty minority position even within the anti-slavery community. The most powerful anti-slavery political force growing out, it was initially the Liberty Party, which started out getting about 2% in national elections, but quickly got a little bit larger, 5, 10, 15% by the time it was the Free Soil Party in some northern states. And they took what is sometimes classed as a more moderate position, but actually, in my view, it was more radical because it had the chance to win a mass support. They argued that, okay, the federal government couldn't outlaw slavery like this, but it could contain slavery, isolate it, remove the support of the federal government, and and then potentially even end the interstate slave trade, take strong actions to cripple slavery in a relatively short amount of time, and above all, organize themselves around a politics of slavery is a moral and political crime, and everyone agrees with this in the North, and vote for us because we're the only party that will actually say that out loud and will address this issue. And those politics had some success. And then in the 1850s, they had a breakthrough in after the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which was a bit of an overreach on the part of the pro-slavery side. But also, there was also just a sort of a ripening and a softening of the political field. You had things like, Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, right? Uncle Tom's Cabin, evincing the popularity of anti-slavery ideas as sort of everyday common sense on the street in the North. And essentially, there was a kind of a dirty break within the Whig Party in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So I know I'm feeding you right now. I'm giving you what you want to hear. Yeah, that's fine. I'm happy to do that because there's an element of this that did play like that,
Mm-hmm.
And there were a lot of conservative and moderate Whigs who said, no, I will never see the Whig Party be broken in two in order to, so that it can be replaced with a sort of an extremist anti-slavery party that will cause a civil war. I'm not pro-slavery, but I would rather hold on to the Whigs than see, because if an anti-slavery party takes power, there will be a civil war. That was the sort of conservative fear, and they were right about that.
Oh well,
essentially. What? But those were the stakes, like right from the beginning, and it was clear that for a lot of the sort of anti-slavery Whigs, some of them were reluctant. The ones who were most entrenched, even the really progressive ones, or even the ones who were genuinely anti-slavery, it helped people on the Underground Railroad. They were still sort of so devoted to the Whig Party that they were, like people like Lincoln, that they were reluctant to leave it. And it was the third party radicals. It was the Salmon Chases and the Henry Wilsons and the Charles Sumners in places like Ohio, in Wisconsin, Michigan, in Massachusetts, in the upper North, that kind of forced the issue and espouse a much bolder mass anti-slavery politics that transformed the party system between 54 and 56. And that was the sort of, arguably, I've been spending the 6 years trying to write this book on which basically covers this period. And I still can't get out of these first 2 years because so much happened with the party system in those years. Anyway, that was a long answer. Yeah.
Matt, that was fantastic. And let me help you with your writing woes. Here's a pitch for you.
Yeah.
Just focus on those years and frame this book as being about the revolution that needs to come. Because what I'm hearing from you, Matt, is that there was a tipping point. There was a moral issue that was so motivating politically and so polarizing, and that there was no political party, neither of the two major political parties was paying any attention at all or meaningfully engaging with what majorities of the public actually wanted. That sounds all very familiar, whether you're talking about Gaza, whether you're talking about healthcare, whether you're talking about raising the flippin' minimum wage. I mean, the bar is on the ground, that this is the world that we live in, and draw those parallels and help people to understand that part of the enemy, a significant part of who they should be seeing as the obstacle to progress in the United States of America, is in fact the Democratic Party. Because my view, and I will own this and be very clear about this with my cards on the table, the reason why I have felt some disconnect with some members of our big leftist online community is that there does seem to be a flank, which I would analogize to the protectionist Whigs, who, yeah, were totally against slavery, but not at the expense of losing an election or not at the expense of having a civil war. Which, talking about in the context of slavery, sounds completely morally bereft. And I would argue is not as, because we're not talking about slavery, but similarly morally bereft in the contemporary moment. But never mind, that's my own aside. But that there are people who are more protective of the status quo than they are, and recognizing that as painful as it's going to be, something more significant has to happen. Something more radical has to happen. And me and my corner of the left, who was willing to see what it looked like to work within the Democratic Party. I gave my mid-30s to Bernie Sanders. I was there. I believed I was willing to try that route. But after 2 cycles of that, and after witnessing the Biden administration and what he did with his majorities, came to the conclusion that the Democratic Party was at least as much as an obstacle, if not an equal or bigger obstacle, because it is supposed to be the vector of our progressive movement, than the Republican Party is. And that something needs to change. That the Democratic Party is organized, and this goes back to your point about the ballot access issues. The Democratic Party is organized with the purpose of stopping us. The Republican Party is organized with the purpose of stopping the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is organized with the purpose of stopping us. The left, the populist majority, however you want to frame it, the majoritarian working class, whatever you want to call it, that's their goal. And the existence of a Democratic Party is to create the perception of democracy and legitimacy to a system that is fundamentally bankrupt. And the more we feed into that without actively lobbying for change, which is hard, I hear that, and no one thinks they're going to snap your fingers overnight and the Green Party is going to become a thing, or PSL, or any new party anybody wants to start. I have no dog in that particular fight. But you just told a story of the Republican Party going, or the Liberty Party going from 2% to 10%, and the Republican Party ultimately winning an election and fighting a war. And,
there's a lot there for you.
And that's a good story.
There's a lot there for you. And I am going to tell that story. And you'll be able to read the book if you can deal with, the weeds of Ohio gubernatorial elections in 1855. But you'll be able to see.
I am from Ohio.
Okay, there you go.
And my mother lives in, maybe I shouldn't say this on the podcast. Well, I'll say it anyway. In James Garfield's, one of James Garfield's family's houses.
Wow. Yeah, Garfield was a young Turk, too. He was in the 50s.
Yeah.
In 1860, he was a red-hot anti-slavery guy. I mean, he became a Gilded Age Republican, but hey, it happens to the best of us. But he started out very, very red. He was like a young kind of assistant professor at a college who was, kind of became a stump speaker for Lincoln. Yeah. Okay. Two quick things, because I've got to run, but two quick things that I would say on that is, one, there's a lot for you here. So, if you think that, I do think this history is useful for people on the left, really broadly conceived. I guess my point of caution would be, one, the slavery question. I'm not sure that the sort of contemporary left has anything like the focus or the sort of the capacity to link the way that the Republicans in fact went from 5% to, because sure, a left-wing party today could, maybe a really successful one in some context, could win 5%, but that doesn't get us very far. The way that they went from 5% to winning in pluralities in the North was by connecting this moral issue, which yes, I think it's sort of summoning the sort of sleeping masses around the moral issue, but also connecting that moral issue to the self-interest and the sort of felt needs of these workers,
I agree,
of these voters. So to find that issue today, it's not just general resistance to the status quo on 17.
It's not healthcare.
Yeah, well,
people are trying to fill this commissary of this Luigi Mangione fellow. Prisoners are shouting from the windows of their prison, "Hey, improve Luigi Mangione's conditions." I mean,
Luigi's conditions suck. Free Luigi. This was just from a few hours ago, and here they are, 10 o'clock as promised. They said earlier today, tell Ashley Banfield that Luigi is watching at 10 o'clock. I mean, obviously, you know, that's just a hard roast at this point because they're not near Luigi in any way.
Can I just ask the guys, if they can hear me right now, to answer yes or no very loud. Does Luigi have television in his single cell?
No.
Unreal. They said no, right? Obviously,
They
we
said
have a little
no.
bit of a
He
delay,
doesn't
but they're
have a TV,
getting.
and that's-
Yeah, they're getting the questions, and they're giving us the
They're
answers. So
getting
Luigi
it.
does not have. Wow, this is quite something. This is the strangest interview I've ever conducted.
Me too, Ashley. You know, according to the Department of Corrections, he's got his own solitary cell. It's not solitary confinement, but he's by himself. It's not dorm style. I'm not sure exactly what those guys got going on in terms of a living situation. It sounds like they're all clustered together. Isn't it interesting to see what accommodations that they have? They got their own light switches. They're obviously watching TV
They're all doing
past
it.
any sort of 10 o'clock curfew, you know?
Piers Morgan is melting down on the idea of this being a left issue. I was just on there yesterday. And then he played a clip of Joe Rogan talking about it, and he had the exact same take I did, and they were all like verklempt.
Well, I
didn't know
mean,
what
that's
to
the
do with
other thing.
themselves.
That's
John, before I come to you, I want to play Joe Rogan, who interestingly had this take.
I don't think this guy was a professional. I think this guy, if I had to guess, some guy who got fucked over. Apparently that company is really bad on denying claims.
34% denial rate.
And
Something
normal's
like,
like 16.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those guys.
I don't think anybody's going to like be crying too hard over that guy.
Yeah, maybe his family, but that's about it.
Yeah.
It's a dirty, dirty business. The business of insurance is fucking gross.
No, but Joe, I mean, it's interesting there. Joe Rogan, you know, he didn't come out and say he felt joyful, but certainly no great tears being shed, no great expression of sympathy. You know, as Brianna, I mean, I wouldn't have phrased it the way she did, and I think to admit you have no empathy for someone when they've been murdered is very bizarre.
Joe Rogan and I had the same take.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm about to make the
Joe
point.
Rogan and I had the exact same
Allow
take.
me to conduct my own interviews, Brianna, if you don't mind.
that's the other thing, Brie, is that when the Republican Party did come into existence, about a quarter or more in some states of its supporters were not just sort of these progressive Whigs who'd finally sort of gotten with it in terms of or finally had a chance to vote for the anti-slavery party they had been wanting to vote for a long time, which I think was true in some places that were, you know, in Western Massachusetts or in upstate New York or in the Western Reserve, Ohio, where people were really red hot against slavery. But there were also a lot of former Democrats, you know, which, you know, and to put the analogy now, this would be former Republicans. There would be a lot. Can you imagine an independent political force that would get something like, you know, 2/3, 3/4 of the current or 2/3 of the current Democratic coalition, a quarter of the current Republican coalition, and then activate a lot of non-voters, which the Republicans did.
I can. And it was
but that's
Bernie
the
Sanders.
coalition.
I can.
Yeah, that's the coalition that you would need. My feeling is that it might look a little bit more like Dan Osborne than the PSL.
That's fine. I don't care. But what I resist is this sort of like tautological argument that says, well, the left can't. The current left isn't this way. We're doing project building. We're doing movement building. We're trying to set the stage for what we want to work on for the next 4 years of a Trump administration at the very least. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.